Right before we jump into this video, if you'd like me to send you a free guide to capturing motion in low light situations, just look for this orange box over on FroKnowsPhoto.com, put your name, email address in it, hit send it, and I'll send you that guide for free. Jared Polin, FroKnowsPhoto.com, and this is a hands-on preview of the Sony a7R V, a camera that a lot of people have been waiting on for a long time. And I'll just get this out of the way right off the bat. The biggest question that everybody has is, does it have the same sensor as the a7R IV? And the answer is yes. We're going to talk more about that as we go through the specs, but let me tell you what I used this camera for. I took it out into the real world to do 3 different shoots. It just so happened that there were a bunch of things happening within the same time period that I was able to go out and shoot. One was my buddy Gloss Black, who painted the mural downstairs here at the factory, was doing another wall locally, so I went out and photographed him. Then I photographed soccer, the Philadelphia Union were playing, and even though this isn't generally the sports type of camera, the new autofocusing system that is in this camera, we're gonna talk about that, and that's why I went ahead and shot soccer. And then finally, I went ahead and photographed in a recording studio. My buddy Will Yip had a band in from Australia. It's kind of low light in there, and that is more of a scene where you would use a camera like this. But honestly, at the end of the day, every camera can be used for just about every type of situation. I do want to let you know that I shot in RAW plus JPEG because at the time of recording this, there was no RAW converter for Adobe Lightroom to allow me to take the RAW files and go into Lightroom, thus why I shot both, and all of the images that you're going to see are edited from JPEGs. And I do want to say that there is a reason that people should be shooting in RAW. The files just come out so much cleaner than editing a JPEG, which already is compressed and has some tweaking, and then editing after the fact. That's just my take on it after using the JPEGs this way, but we know the image quality out of this camera is going to be very similar to what you would have found in the a7R IV because it's using the same sensor. And I'll also be sure to answer, if you already own an a7R IV, should you get an a7R V by the end of this video. We're also filming this video with the a7R V. That's what we're shooting with right here, so you can see the quality and the results. Now let's get into the specs, let's get into the body, let's talk about the autofocus, let's get right into it. It has a very similar body to the a7 IV. The button layout, the button design, the quick dial on top with the video modes, the hot shoe with the digital hot shoe, it's all basically the same thing that you found in the a7 IV. It's kind of like the a7R IV and the a7 IV got together, and now we have the a7R V. Sony always does this. They do some tweaks in some of their lower end cameras. They'd either trickle up or trickle down from their more expensive cameras into the lower end cameras, and it's kind of like the proving ground for showing you where their roadmap is going to lead us, and that's what we get inside of this camera. As I've already said a couple of times before, we have the same 61 megapixel BSI sensor as we found in the R4. It is in the R5 now, but with some tweaks with the Bionz XR processor and not just the Bionz X processor, which they had in the older camera. They're saying that you will get greater image quality with this new processor. I mean, they're always going to say that stuff. Sony is very good with their marketing. We like to call it propaganda when we sit through a phone call because they do hammer home these points, and there's some points they're going to hammer home in just a minute that we will get to. Now, there's different RAW options that you have this time. You can have RAW small at 15 megapixels. You can have RAW medium at 26 megapixels, and of course, you get the large RAW file at 61 megapixels, but the 26 megapixel one, which is the medium, is oversampled from 60 or 61, and there is also a mode for APS-C crop mode, which also gives you 26 megapixels if you want to bang in even more for those birder shooters who just can't get close enough to shoot that titmouse over there in the corner. In terms of ISO, we've got ISO ranging natively from 100 to 32,000. I still don't know why they don't go to 64, where the Nikon Z7 and Nikons always can go to 64 with their highest resolution camera. cameras. Maybe because this is 61 megapixels, they just don't believe that they can go down any lower and give them the clean images that the engineers are looking for. You can probably take it down to the low mode of 50, but that's usually not recommended. 100 is the native ISO. Now, I did push it up to 8,000 ISO when I was photographing in the studio with Will Yip. And remember, these are the JPEG images. I also had the noise reduction still on in the menu system because when I was setting it up, I don't like the menu. I missed that setting. I usually turn that off, the high ISO noise reduction, but in this case, it was left on. And I can see some smoothing that it does to the JPEGs. That will have no effect on the RAW files, and even the JPEG at 8,000 ISO looks perfectly fine. The RAW file is going to be very good as well. So maybe that's a slight step up from the A7R IV, which was okay with its 61 megapixels. It's a lot of megapixels, but maybe with the new Bion's XR processor, you are going to squeeze out a little bit more quality at those higher ISOs. Now, they did add the new tile menu interface, which is something that they added with the FX30, and for photographers, I really don't think it's necessary in cameras like this because you already have the function menu, which is easy to hit with one button. But what Sony already does that's fantastic is you can map out just about every single button on this camera to be exactly what you want it to be, so you don't have to go back in to the menu system at all to find what you're looking for. With all that being said, I really don't like this menu. I know a lot of people didn't like the older Sony menus, but then were like, wow, the new Sony menus are so amazing. I think they're the worst of the big three. I think Nikon gets it right. They've been doing it for 20 years with a very similar design that you just know where things are. It just makes sense. And Canon does a great job with their menu system. There's only one page. You don't ever have to scroll down. You can scroll over to other menu systems, but it's much easier to find things. Whereas with this Sony, things are all over the place. Whether it's eye detection or bird detection or train detection, it's just all over the place. And I find it's still confusing. And it's not just from using it more that I'll get better at it. It's just stuff is all over the place and you're like, why is it there? So there's just way too many options. Let me cut in here real quick to let you know that this video is brought to you by B&H. You know, that massive camera store in New York City. And no, I'm not gonna talk about Steph Mantis. If you know, you know. Anyway, you can be one of the first to pre-order the A7R V when you head on over to B&H or click the direct link down below in the description. And check this out. When you use the Paybu card to make your purchase, you pay the tax, but B&H pays you back that same amount instantly. No need to redeem any points, nada. That means whatever you pay in tax, you get back. For more information on Paybu or to pre-order this camera, head on over to bhphotovideo.com. Now, let's get back to the video. Now let's move on to autofocus. We've got 693 phase detection autofocusing points. This is the marketing/propaganda that Sony gave us, but it has a new dedicated AI processing unit. So that is a separate processor that is just there for the autofocus, and it uses deep learning, which is supposed to give us better subject recognition. So basically, it recognizes human bodies even better. They talked about skeletal recognition, where this time it will find the torso or the body, or it does a better job of finding the face or the head, or when someone spins around, it's gonna find the back of their head and still focus on them so that when they spin back around, it has their face. To demonstrate this, when I was shooting soccer, you can see the green box that is getting a little larger on the player's torso, or then it finds the face or the eye, or when they spin around, it finds their body even better than before. And it's not those two green lines on the side of the box, which is the lock-on tracking. This is where the AI is actually coming into play and doing a good job of finding and tracking the subject and staying on them longer. Because that is one of the things that Sony pushed to us, is that you'll be able to lock onto a subject in a sport situation, maybe if it's birds flying, and then if some distraction gets in the way, that it's not going to lose it. It's going to stick on the subject longer. And I saw this with Blake, the goalie for the Philadelphia Union, that it just stayed on him. And when someone crossed in his path, it stayed back and jumped back on him. So with Blake, that was during the warm-ups. It did a good job on that. But what about during the game? So there was a situation where there was a penalty kick coming up, and I switched over to the 70-200 because I wanted to go a little wider to get the guy who's gonna kick the ball and the goalie diving, and I ended up getting a good shot of that, but it ended up going back into the lock-on tracking because there was so much going on. And he scored the goal, and the box is right on him as he's getting picked up by his teammates, because I believe he just got a hat trick, and for whatever reason, it locked onto the subject right behind him, the guy wearing a white jersey, which didn't make any sense because the focusing point was right where it should be. So I ended up missing that shot because it focused on a different subject and stayed locked on that subject. Now, this isn't the only camera to have this issue. I've had this issue with the Canon R3. I've had the issue with the Z9. I've had it with all of these cameras when shooting soccer and going wider. So sometimes you may want to not rely on this AI or the deep learning that some of these cameras have and just resort to the just focusing point right in the middle. Except for if someone crosses that focusing point, it's going to end up switching and focusing on that person and not staying locked on. So I'm happy with how this new autofocusing system works. I feel like it's very similar to what we've seen across the board with Canon's dual pixel AF2. Now, Canon also uses deep learning. They didn't hammer it home as hard as Sony did on this one, but I will say that one of the reasons I went to the R3 over the A1 was the fact that I just felt that it was stickier and found the subjects better at a distance. And now seeing this A7R5 with this new chip in there, I think the autofocus has done a really good job. It is more sticky. It does lock on and track better. It does find those faces and eyes at a distance better. So I think it's doing a really good job in comparison to all of the, the R10, the R7, the R5, the R6, the R3. I think they're all doing really well across the board. And this is something that Sony has done very well, is they put this new tech into one of their cameras, and it's a harbinger of what's to come next. We know that if there's an A9 III, it's going to get a similar processor. And we know when an A1 II or something comes out, you're going to see something similar to this. So I think they are on the right path finally, after just sitting back a little longer with their autofocus and then having Canon come out and kind of kick their ass into gear. So I did notice something with the autofocus pulsing when I was in the studio with Will Yip. And I don't know if this is a firmware update that needs to happen either to the lens or to the body, because we are using a pre-production camera, so it's pre-production firmware, but I noticed like this super fast shifting of pulsing. I could feel it with the lens and I could see it, that it's kind of like a warble when it was trying to get that hyper focus. It's much faster than what we would have seen in like a Z6 or a Z7, where that was just hunting and trying to find. This was right where it needed to be, but I did notice that it would just do that little pulsating thing. One of the other things I noticed in the studio as well is that sometimes it would find the eye, then it would jump to the head with the box, and then the box would disappear altogether. So I might chalk that up to a firmware issue, but it didn't cause me to miss the shot. You know what? Let's just show it to you in action out at the Philadelphia Union game. So how do you think it worked? Do you like the way that the new box looked and locked on and tracked? Let me know down below. Sony went ahead and put in some new subject tracking options here. You've got detection for face, body, and head, as well as vehicles, trains, airplanes, as well as insects. I don't understand the airplanes thing. I don't understand the vehicle thing. It can track those already. And the train, how many times are you shooting trains? They're coming right at you. And don't go on those tracks. I've told you a million times, don't go on the tracks and don't take pictures. Those photos are terrible and you could die. Yes, you could die if you go on the tracks. So don't go on the tracks. I will continue to yell about that. So those options are there, but you also have your animal tracking, your face and head detect for animals. And the issue here is that there are so many new options that you have that how do you even get through the menu system to know what you want to get to? So Sony needs to do a better job of tightening up the menu system for switching between these modes. Being that this is a 61 megapixel camera, it is not built for speed in terms of shooting. None of the higher megapixel cameras that Sony has put out are really built for a ton of frames per second. Now again, Sony tells us that you get 10 frames per second with this camera, and that's kind of true because you can get 10 frames per second when you're shooting compressed RAW, but if you want to shoot uncompressed or lossless compressed RAW, you're only getting roughly 6-ish frames a second, which is very slow when you're trying to capture that bird flying or you're trying to capture the action that's happening in front of you. If you're a landscape shooter, that's not really going to matter. If you're a portrait shooter, it's not going to matter that much. I personally shoot in uncompressed RAW with all of the cameras. Every camera that gives me that option, that's how I'm personally going to shoot. In this case, we're getting a 126 megabyte RAW file that you're going to end up getting. So that's frames per second for mechanical shutter, but what about if you go into silent mode and use the electronic shutter? Well, we got roughly 4 when it came to silent compressed. Roughly 4 frames, 4 or 5 frames. It's not very fast at all, which is interesting because something like a Canon R5 is going to give you 20 frames per second. Now that's only 45 megapixels, but you're getting 20 frames per second with their electronic shutter option. So I don't know why we end up dumbing it down when we go into the silent mode with this Sony. Not that you really will find yourself shooting silent with this camera that often. It's not really meant for that. But of course, if you need to shoot silent, you do have the option to do that, especially if you don't want to make noise. I will say that the shutter is a little louder than what you would find in the shutter of an R6 or an R5. So it was very interesting shooting in the recording studio and hearing a shutter go off this time. I haven't heard a shutter go off in a long time. Let me jump in here real quick because I want to show you this photo taken with the A7R5 and edited with FroPack 3. Now keep in mind, it's a JPEG because like I said, I can't open the RAW files just yet, but the good news is FroPack 3, 1 and 2 all work great on JPEGs as well. Let me show you here. We've got Fifth Element, followed by Almost Famous, which looks great, followed by Capone, Eckert, King Contrast, Mount Airy, November Rain, Prestige Worldwide, Walter White, and Zoolander. But check this out on this image right here. My favorite of all time from FroPack 1 is Skittles. With one click, boom, that picture comes to life. So look, if you're looking to edit your RAW files to speed up your RAW workflow or work on JPEGs either on the desktop or mobile, we created 15 custom Lightroom presets that you can check out right now at FroKnowsPhoto.com/FroPack3. While you're over there, you can play with the sliders to see the befores and the afters, and if you decide to pick them up right now, they are currently on sale. Or if you want to grab Skittles as part of FroPack 1, you can get the triple play bundle and save even more. Now, let's get back to the preview. Continuing on, let's go to the memory card slots. We have dual CF Express A cards. You will not see CF Express B cards probably in any Sony camera at this point. They are going all in on these dual card slots. So you have 2 of them, CF Express Type A, which can also be reverse compatible and use SD cards right there as well. Now, if you do use SD cards and you shoot uncompressed RAW, just know you may be slowing down your shooting a little bit because it's 126 megabytes per image that are going to the cards. These cards are expensive. You're gonna need at least 160 gigabyte cards if you're gonna do the RAW uncompressed. It gives you a little over 1,000 pictures. I shoot redundant, so I got 2 of those cards in the camera at all time, plus 2 as a backup for if I fill those up. So just know that those cards are a little more expensive expensive. You could use SD if you really want, but just know there might be a speed difference when you go in there. Now here's something that's new. We finally have a new LCD screen. We've got a new 4-axis multi-angle 3.2-inch 2.1 million dot touchscreen. You kind of get the best of both worlds. You can flip the screen down a little bit if that's how you like to shoot, but you could also flip it out and rotate it and reverse it and you can flip it out and rotate it and do what you want with it. I actually used the vertical flip out option when I was in the studio because it gave me an even lower angle and I could still get my line straight. Also, when you flip it out to the side, it's much more parallel to the side of the camera, unlike the Canons, which always have a little tilt to it, which makes it much more difficult to get your line straight if you rely on just the LCD screen. So that, of course, is a nice new option that we may see in future Sony cameras. In terms of the EVF, you have a 9.44 million dot EVF with 120 frames per second refresh rate. They did add the variable shutter option. I guess for if you're shooting silent, you can shoot those tweener 1/850th 0.255th of a second if you want to do that. Most of the time you're not going to find yourself using that option too often. You do have pixel shift shooting with 240 megapixel file that you're going to end up getting, and they did add some features that will correct for, say, leaves moving, something little small, so that's a nice feature that they added there. And an option that we've seen on Canon and Nikons for a long time now is focus bracketing. You now have focus bracketing in this camera, and just know that you will need to use an external program to stack those back up, but at least you have it. All right, now on to the video features. Now, this is not a video-centric camera, but of course, it does give you the option to do that. Currently, we're filming in 8K at 24p in S-Log3, which is the camera's highest resolution. Now, it's giving us 420 color in H.265. So you do have the ability to shoot 8K up to 24p with full pixel readout with a 1.2x crop. You do have 4K 60, but with pixel binning on top of another 1.2x crop. I still don't understand people crying about a camera needing to have 4K 60. It's not that big of a deal to have 4K 60. You have it here, but I still don't understand why people are like, you gotta have 4K 60 or it's a bust. I still don't understand why that is. Now, if you want the highest, cleanest, sharpest quality, you can shoot 4K Super 35 up to 30p, which is oversampled from 6.2K. Now, there is a full HDMI port. The design of this camera gives you heat dissipating design, of course. Heat dissipating because we all know what happened with the Canon R5. And they say you'll get up to 30 minutes of recording with 8K, which is what we are shooting in right now. As a side note, we've been filming in 8K for close to 40 minutes, and we haven't had an issue at all. And one of the last new features is the IBIS. You have 8 stops of IBIS. Now, that's not in combination with another lens, because you can even take a 50mm 1.2 that doesn't have image stabilization, and you can get that up to 8 stops of stabilization with that lens as well. So now let's get to pricing. This camera will set you back $3,899. It's not a bad price. It's what you would expect. It's kind of in line with what the A7R IV was when that thing came out. So the question that I posed earlier is, if you already have an A7R IV, should you upgrade to an A7R V? And the answer is, if you're a professional, I would probably say, sure, sell your A7R IV for as much money as you can get and roll it into the latest and greatest technology, because you make money with your gear. If you're a hobbyist who just does this for fun, then no, you don't need to upgrade it. If you're a birder who loves the megapixels, I hate birding photography personally, but if you want better autofocus, then the answer is yes, go ahead and upgrade this. It's going to help you out, because the new autofocusing system with that new sensor or that new chip inside is much better. But what about somebody trying to decide between this high megapixel camera and something like the Canon R5? I mean, the R5 is built for speed, 12 frames a second, 20 frames per second with the electronic shutter. I mean, it's 45 megapixels. I like the way that that camera works. I like their ecosystem, but we're gonna put together a video where we compare these cameras side by side to help you decide which one might be right for you. It's more for you to decide. Do you want the speed? Do you want the lower megapixels? Do you want the higher megapixels? They're basically priced the same thing, so you have to decide which one is right for you. And if you really need more speed, you want to shoot faster, you could look at an A9 III when that gets announced at some point, because I'm assuming that's going to happen. Or if you want to spend even more money and get the best of the best with the Honor Sir from Sony, you're going to be looking at an A1. Let me jump in here real quick and say, did you know that we have a podcast? Well, it's called the FroKnowsPhoto Raw Talk Podcast, and you can get it wherever you listen to your podcast. Or head on over to FroKnowsPhoto.com/podcast to check out the past episodes, and just know we put new episodes out every Friday. Now, let's get back to the video. So in just a second, we're going to show you a slideshow from the images that I captured. I'm happy with the results that I got. I wish this camera shot a little faster, but then on the flip side, I can grab the A1 to shoot up to 30 frames per second at 50 megapixels. I do think the future is looking brighter for Sony now because of the way that they've tweaked this autofocus. I think we're going to see that, as I've already said, pushed into the future cameras. For me, I'm going to go with an A1 or an A1 II. For someone who doesn't need that or doesn't want to spend that money, this is a very good option on Sony's front. If you already own it, we already talked about what to do. If you're just getting into the ecosystem, then this is a pretty good place to start if you want 61 megapixels. So be sure to let me know what you guys think down below. Thank you very much for watching. Jared, Polin, FroKnowsPhoto.com. See ya.